Welcome to Victoria Rumble Room. I'm Robin Adair, and along with my co-host John Jurisic, we pride ourselves in bringing you lots of good pugilistic opinions and ideas, things that are happening in British Columbia and Canada, around the world, and we try to add some punch and some levity to the shows. But once in a while, things happen that sort of overwhelm what we're on here to do, and this is one of those times, as we have just lost a major political figure in British Columbia.
Former Premier John Horgan has lost his long battle with cancer. He sadly passes away at the age of 65. Much will be said about his legacy, but the most important thing to remember is that he was keenly devoted to public service and tried his best for every British Columbian.
I don't think anyone could argue that point, John. And, we were all very concerned when we saw John Horgan suddenly resign as premier, and we knew he had cancer then. It looked like it had gone into remission. He was appointed the ambassador of Canada in Germany. He was Canada's ambassador in Germany and served there, and then had a reoccurrence of cancer. That did not look good. This is really sad news. Our deepest condolences, of course, go to his family.
So where do we go from here? Let's shift to something that is sad for some, but not for all. The return of Donald Trump. A lot of Canadians have questioned U.S. voters in bringing him back. In our last show, we spelled some of the worries we had about these Republicans to Canada.
Absolutely, John. It was just amazing. It's amazing, the list of things that we outlined that's getting a lot of blowback from our viewers.
Those being Trump's enthusiasm for protectionism, his retreat from global engagements, his embrace of authoritarian leaders, and of course, make America great again. We're not including in our list at all, which is, however, big problem for us, is that Donald Trump really doesn't like Justin Trudeau, which makes it even tougher for anything to happen and for us to get along. Man, we're going to be in for a tough and rocky ride.
We're getting a rocky ride even from some of our viewers, Johnny. We do have some folks out there that are Canadians, and they really like Donald Trump. They think Donald Trump's going to be a breath of fresh air, and they're disappointed that we have taken what they consider a negative stand against Donald. We're only saying that there could be some adverse effects for Canada. We don't know yet. We're going to give Donald the benefit of the doubt, but only to a point. And we did have a comment from an old pal of ours who's been a contributor to this show in the past, Paul. I don't believe Trump's tariff claims will affect Canada very much. I don't think he'll pull out of military alliances. America First is just more campaign rhetoric. And Paul, at least, feels very optimistic about the future and thinks we should give Donald Trump the benefit of the doubt.
Paul, thank you for your comments. Problem is that Trump has stated all of these things clearly and has indicated that he will do all of them. So, benefit of the doubt or not, I guess we're going to have to wait till next year. So what do other analysts have to say about the return of the Republicans who now control the presidency, the Congress, the Supreme Court, everything else that has to do with decision making? Well, Konstantin Kisin is a British commentator, very popular on Twitter, who has a list of trends he sees in the USA.
This video is for my British and European friends who are shocked, surprised, and horrified at Donald Trump's landslide victory. Here are 10 reasons you didn't see it coming. 1. Americans love their country and want it to be the best country in the world. America is a nation of people who conquered a continent. They love strength. They love winning. Any leader who appeals to that has an automatic advantage. 2.
So we're going to continue with Kissin's top 10, John, and we're going to shorten them down a little bit from his dissertation, but we're very interested in what he has to say. His second point, Americans won't accept decline and believe in producing their own energy to ensure their prosperity. Point number 3, Americans don't believe official stats about inflation, but instead feel prices have gone sky high. Americans don't believe in socialism. This is point 4. They don't mind the super rich because it shows anyone can become successful, and they celebrate this.
He covers a lot of ground here, and you and I, folks know that you and I love to express our opinions. But something we've never been able to understand is how Americans, now in the majority, feel and think the way that they do. This really, really helps. Turning to point number 5, Americans are pro-immigration, but hate people arriving illegally. 6th point, Americans are sensitive about race issues. They reject that in order to atone for errors of the past, that new errors must be made. They reject the diversity, equality, and inclusion philosophy as racist.
And I think they even think of it as kind of woke, John. And again, we're talking about Republican Americans, which amounts to a little over half the voting population of the United States. It's a lot of people. And we move forward on Kissin's list, his top 10 list on how to read Americans. Number 7, Americans are the most pro-Israeli nation, and the pro-Hamas reaction from the left is largely rejected because of memories of 9/11 and the jihad. And Americans are extremely practical people. That's number 8, who produce leading engineers, business leaders, and investors. They care far more about Trump's policies than his rhetoric. Number 9, Americans hate negativity and the woke view of history. They believe in moving forward, not obsessing about the past. And number 10, Americans are resistant to government overreach. They loathe unnecessary restrictions, regulations, and control. They believe self-reliance ensures freedom.
It's fascinating to look at this list and consider that some of these cultural trends that we've just talked about have made their way north of the border. Ouch! Certainly in Canada, there's much wider acceptance of big government. So, no doubt, attitudes are different. But perhaps this helps explain how millions of Americans feel differently about the world we live in. Very much worthwhile trying to figure that out for us.
Well, you know, some of these views are held by Canadians and always have been. For example, there are Canadians who believe we've gone too far into the woke sector and would like to see that pulled back. There's other areas where we do share many issues and ideas and cultural values with Americans, but then there are others where we really don't. So for more on Donald Trump and what all of this means to Canadians and the world, we turn now to a prominent thinker and professor from Nova Scotia, an expert on Canada-U.S. relations. Let's zoom him in. Now joining us in the Victoria Rumble Room for the first time, a distinguished guest all the way from the proud province of Nova Scotia. And he is a professor at St. Francis Xavier University, a professor of public policy and governance, and the Hudson Chair of Canada-U.S. Relations. He is Asa McKercher, and sir, so great to have you on the program.
Pleasure to be here with you both. Thanks for the invite.
Absolutely.
Well, we've got lots to talk about. Things are still shaking down or shaking out about the Donald Trump experience in Canada. A lot of people in Canada are concerned. Some people are saying there's nothing to worry about. So there's a debate going on in this country, and I'm sure the debate is even louder in the United States right now. So my first question is, do you really think Canadians have a lot to be worried about now with Donald back in the White House?
I think we do. The previous Trump administration was I don't think anyone quite expected he would become president, including himself. By all accounts, he seemed pretty surprised. And so his administration really wasn't prepared. There wasn't sort of a transition team. And so a lot of it was sort of fly-by-night, seat-of-the-pants sort of policy making. And that allowed Canada to really be able to, use some friends in Congress and some friends in the American business community to really kind of, push our side of things in the negotiations over the kind of NAFTA 2 agreement and pushing back against tariffs and a variety of other kinds of things. This time, it's a much more professional operation. There's a lot of think tanks, sort of MAGA kind of America First kind of think tanks with a lot of young people wet behind the ears ready to join that administration. They've been drawing up transition lists and policy platforms for quite a while. And so I think they'll be hitting the ground running to implement his agenda. And of course, top of mind is two things really that will impact Canadians. One is cracking down on migration or illegal migration. And the other is trade, particularly tariff issues. So we'll probably get into those in a bit, but
Yes.
those are two big issues, and I think they will fundamentally impact us in Canada.
So great to have you in the Victoria Rumble Room, all the way over here on the West Coast.
Coast to coast, it's great.
Although we have a global
Absolutely.
reach.
Yeah.
We really want to thank Chris Kilford, President of Victoria Branch of the Canadian International Council, for mentioning you. Thank you very much. Asa, you're the editor of Canada's Journal of Global Policy Analysis. So you've written extensively about Trump and the MAGA movement. Tell me about this Make America Great slogan. Why has this kind of thing attracted so many millions of voters?
Sure. I think it speaks to the sense that I think many Americans and people, for instance, in Canada, feel too that there were glory days at one point that are, I speak as a millennial. My parents, my grandparents had, a tough time of it here and there. I mean, my grandparents lived through the Depression, but with enough hard work, there were well-paying jobs. You could afford a house, you could afford a car, you could afford a trip here and there. Some of the appliances and kind of nicer things in life. And of course, for a lot of people, younger people my age and, maybe a bit younger particularly, but even older people as well, those days seem long gone. And, as a historian, you can say, well, things were tough actually in the 60s and 70s. There was a lot of inflation and other kinds of things, which of course has reared its head today. It's not quite the glory days we think of it maybe, but in the kind of big macroeconomic sense, there was a time when things seemed a little better for people. And if you had that kind of bargain, that kind of hard work bargain, it paid off in some ways. You could afford a house, you could afford, kind of necessities and more. And for lots of people, of course, that doesn't seem to be the case. That's why we saw, a shift in young votes towards Mr. Trump and other kinds of things. But for other people, of course, in a geographic kind of sense, people living in the U.S. Midwest or where I used to live in Southwest Ontario, those factories have closed, things have moved. So I think he really feeds into that, that sense of grievance that I think a lot of people had. The global economy that benefits university professors like me and people living on the coastal elites, maybe not the coastal elites here in Canada, but the coastal elites, in the United States. The benefit of those people. And I think he's also, of course, on the back of inflation, which just is a killer for governments over the last, this huge year of elections we've just had around the world. Incumbents are in a pretty perilous place with this monster of inflation.
So the impression I have is that what Donald Trump is saying to people, particularly working people, and you mentioned a lot of these jobs got shipped overseas, multinationals thought this is the great way to go forward, and a lot of multinational people made a lot of money doing this, but a lot of Main Street middle class, working class people lost their jobs. We now have the rich getting richer, the poor getting poorer in the United States, the shrinking of the middle class. Trump is intimating he's going to bring those jobs back. And he's also talking about putting the squeeze on countries like China, Southeast Asia, Europe. And of course, what we worry about, it could include Canada. He's talking about tariffs. And I thought we had a free trade agreement. I thought Trump kind of tinkered around with it and he changed the name of it, but NAFTA seemed like it was going to stay and that we were going to be somewhat protected. Should we be worried about tariffs being implemented irrespective of our free trade deal?
Sure. Yeah, I think we should. There's been some reporting from a CBC reporter named Alex Panetta. He's very good. I think he's there in Washington anyway, wherever he is. But he was reporting on the efforts by the Canadian government over the past week or so to find out, with people in Trump's orbit, so Mr. Trump has promised a 10% tariff. It's a little bit more complicated than that because it'll actually can rise over time and things. It could go up to 20%. But would this include an exemption for Canada? Because we do have that free trade agreement. And the consensus is, probably not. So we're looking at 10% tariffs immediately, perhaps. Again, Mr. Trump's administration seems pretty prepared to hit the ground running in a way it wasn't, the first time around. And that 10% tariff can then increase year by year by 5% increments, depending on a formula in a variety of things. So that's irrespective of the kind of the problem with the Canada-U.S. Mexico Free Trade Agreement is it's a piece of paper, but there's no supranational body, organization, world government that can enforce it. So it's kind of rests on, in effect, goodwill, as
Well,
most
and of course, it doesn't work
international.
with everything. We've seen it
Oh,
not
sure,
work
sure.
with our softwood lumber. I mean, it hasn't made any
Well, I was
difference
just going to
there.
say, out in BC, are of course acutely aware of those kinds of things. So, yeah, I mean, the letter of the law and the way it's implemented is a problem with international law in general. From the laws of war to laws of trade. So, now there's some question about the motives, I guess, by Mr. Trump. Will this apply to Canada in the kind of ramping up to the renegotiation, or I should say it's a mandatory review of the new free trade agreement, which will come in 2026. It'll most likely be a renegotiation because I think Mr. Trump will want to tinker around with some things. So that's, is it going to be used as kind of a gambit for that? Is it particularly in the Canadian case going to be used to force us to spend more on defense? That's something that some of the people in Trump's orbit have indicated. If we're not going to spend the 2% tariff on GDP, we're essentially going to pay a 10% tax until we do. Although if our economy goes into shambles, it'll be harder to pay that 2%. Well, actually, if there's a decline in our GDP, I guess the 2% would kind of automatically happen just because our GDP would take. But that's another issue. So there might be several motivations. The other motivation is just Mr. Trump's hope to bring industrial jobs home. So if you're going to set up, you're an investor.
Is that easy to do? It sounds so
Well,
simple the way he says everything.
yeah.
Yeah, we're going to bring those jobs back. I mean, how do you do that? You yank factories out of Southeast Asia, you break up contracts with countries that thought they had in goodwill these long-term deals, and you bring companies back to the United States. Presumably, the people in the States will still want to make a lot more money working in those factories than they do in Southeast Asia or China. Does this really work easily?
Well, that's the theory. And certainly, not just jobs in Southeast Asia, but jobs in Canada too, right? The automotive industry, I think I'd be really worried if I were people in the automotive industry, because if you own a company or you're an investor, if your company is going to, be based in Southwest Ontario and pay a 10% tax.
We mentioned Chris Kilford from CIC earlier. He's also a retired lieutenant colonel who served in the Canadian Armed Forces. Canada has made significant commitments to NATO. Donald Trump has never been a fan of NATO, or Canada for that matter. What does your crystal ball say about European security in general and Ukraine in particular?
If I were in Ukraine right now and I wasn't a pro-Russian person living in Ukraine, I'd be looking for my passport. I think we'll see an end of U.S. military aid to Ukraine in the 20th of January. I hope Mr. Biden and our government and the European government can put as much stuff into that country over the next 72 days or whatever it is. But my God, I think they're in trouble. So that's obviously not good, because then obviously we have, maybe there'll be some sort of agreement that Mr. Trump can broker, or maybe it'll just be another collapse of Ukraine. I don't know. I mean, who knows? There's been some rumors, I think in the New York Times, there was some reporting Mr. Trump's floating the idea of a demilitarized zone and other kinds of things. I mean, I don't know if we can count on Mr. Putin to respect those kinds of things. Anyway, the point is European security is a big ticket item. So, the Europeans have already been spending more on their defense. We've promised to spend more on our defense, and I think it's clear, we've got this bizarre formula to maybe spend more by 2032. But if we're looking at, to seriously think about European security as an important aspect of Canadian security, which has been what we've thought since 1949, and if we include the two world wars, for over a century, we've really got to put our money where our mouth is. And that's on top, of course, of the issue of Mr. Trump wanting Canada to spend more, and perhaps linking that to tariffs and other kinds of things. So his former ambassador to Canada, Kellyanne Craft, who's still a close personal friend and advisor to him, has been several times over the last week on CTV News. She's made it pretty clear that there's an expectation in the Trump team that Canada is going to need to spend more on our defense, particularly aimed at continental defense, which is obviously what the Trump administration is really concerned about, but also border issues and cyber and other kinds of things in the broader kind of national security
Well, we
natural
live in a
disasters.
military town here in
Sure.
Victoria,
Yeah, of course.
as you folks do on in Nova Scotia
Yeah.
in Halifax. That's the other big naval base, and I think there's a feeling amongst people that we know, people in the military community, that they feel it's been underfunded and underappreciated for a long time, and maybe it's time we picked up our role a little better in helping to defend world security. But another big promise that Trump has been talking about, and you touched on it when we first started this interview, all these illegal immigrants that have made their way into the United States, and I think he's talking about what 6 or 7 million of them that he's ready to force them out, to send them out of the United States because they don't like people coming illegally. Well, suddenly, magically, these people are going to be looking for somewhere to land. I can't imagine how many will be looking north, but I have to think it'll be quite a few. How does Canada cope with that? We're already now curtailing the numbers in Canada because we say we don't have enough housing for the people that are already coming. This could be a real crisis if suddenly we have tens of thousands of immigrants arriving from the United States unexpectedly.
Sure. I mean, I think the number is actually about 11 million
Jeez.
illegal, or undocumented or illegal. I don't know the terminology anyway. I don't want to be canceled for using the wrong term. And that's on top of the fact that many of these people, of course, have family members. And the previous director of ICE, the Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agents, Trump's previous director of ICE was interviewed last week. He will likely be the next director as well. And he said essentially, he was asked essentially, how will we prevent the breakup of families? And he said, well, we'll just deport families, even if they're American citizens or not. So the number could be far larger than 11 million. I mean, it's just incomprehensible to comprehend in some ways, because as you're right, those people, many of them will come across the border. And this is exactly what happened in the previous Trump administration when he moved to deport Haitians and some other illegal immigrants, and many of them, of course, came across at Roxham Road and in other places, primarily the Roxham Road crossing in Quebec, but other places.
But it wasn't tens and tens of thousands of people. It was
and so
hundreds of thousands, right?
Yeah, well, Canada we were ill-equipped to deal with I think the total number was about 30,000 who eventually came through Roxham Road over several years. What are we going to do when, as you say, it could be tens of thousands per month, hundreds of thousands? The immigration minister the other day, 2 days ago, anyway, was saying, "Oh, we've been looking at this and studying this, and there doesn't really seem to be a sense of urgency, because as you noted, and we're already in Canada suffering from issues connected to immigration, the huge numbers of people coming in, a lot of unskilled workers and other kinds of people have really put pressure obviously on housing and all kinds of other things. What are we going to do with this huge influx of people? And of course, many of them undocumented already, some of them, involved in criminal networks and other kinds of things. And what happens, of course, it's Trump's going to take office in January. The weather's not going to be very kind in much of our country for the first few months of this. And if it's, of course, ongoing, there's going to be winters and winters. And so we're going to hear, I think, terrible stories of families freezing to death in the middle of nowhere in our country.
Oh, boy. My final question for you is the ripple effect of Donald Trump on Canadian politics. So we're sort of providing this pathway to Canada here with our various amount of questions.
Sure, yeah.
People in Canada generally don't like his style of politics. I think that's safe to say. Pierre Poilievre and the Conservatives are building a strong challenge to government with massive support across the country. All of that being said, Poilievre uses catchphrases like axe to tax, kind of has a Donald Trump feel and ring to it. Does Poilievre need to be careful not to get too tied in with some potentially momentous anti-Trump feelings generating in Canada if some of these issues become big problems for our country?
Yes, I think most Canadians have a generally fond view of Americans, but that anti-American element of our nationalism, of our identity, is always lurking there, right? And it tends to increase in times when there are unpopular Republican presidents, Ronald Reagan, George W. Bush, Mr. Trump. So the problem then will be, and again, I don't think there's any comparison between Mr. Poilievre and Mr. Trump beyond a kind of a populist, reflection of the kind of forgotten person out of the elites. But I think I don't think Mr. Trump, to be fair, is a very intelligent person. I think Mr. Poilievre is excellently intelligent, not just as a political person. Mr. Trump's a very good politician, but I think Mr. Poilievre has a head in his brain, or brain in his head as well. So yeah, he's got to be careful, I think, to not, particularly on maybe on social issues. That's something the liberals love to declare that conservatives have these secret agendas and hidden agendas and things. He's got to, I think, have a good responses when there are going to be some bozo, what they used to call bozo interruptions. I think Mr. Harper used to call bozo interruptions, backbenchers, filmed at a MAGA rally or filmed at a MAGA hat, or he's got to be prepared for those kinds of things. But I think also the liberals, and I don't necessarily trust Mr. Trudeau not to do this, but they've got to be very careful about playing the anti-American card too in any kind of upcoming election or in the ramp up to an election.
I want to ask about Trudeau. I think that's how we're going to wrap this thing.
Sure. Yeah.
I mean, John and I are old enough now, which says, I guess, about how old we're getting, John, that we do remember when Pierre Trudeau was the Prime Minister of Canada. There's lots of things that were good and lots of things that were bad about Pierre Trudeau. But one of the things that I think we always took some pride in was when he was overseas, he didn't take guff from anybody. He was very, very strong with U.S. presidents. He was very well known and certainly assertive in Europe, and people felt kind of good about Trudeau's performance on the international stage. I would say the very opposite has been true of Justin Trudeau. He's fumbled things in China. He's definitely fumbled things in India, and he and Donald Trump have had a very poor relationship. I'm putting the best possible spin on it. It hasn't been successful. Do you think Pierre Poilievre, because of his political background and maybe the fact he's also basically in small c conservative, can get along better with Trump than, or is it anybody in Canada going to get along better with Trump, who's really he's going to go the way he's going to go, and Canada better get used to the idea?
I mean, my gut says I think Mr. Poilievre could have a better relationship with Mr. Trump for the reasons you noted, a fellow kind of common touch with a common man and woman, this sense of being a conservative. I think within the kind of MAGA sphere within the United States, in terms of the media and other kinds of things, Mr. Trudeau is viewed as woke and broke and out to lunch on a whole series of things, as the love child of Fidel Castro, a line that Mr. Trump talked about in a podcast a few weeks ago or a few months ago. So I think just in his kind of public perception, public reputation, Mr. Trudeau is, and I mean, I think the Americans can see that Mr. Trudeau is doubtful to survive another election, right? So what leverage does he have in negotiations? Well, probably not very much. In addition to the fact that probably on a personal level, I don't think there's a lot of friendship going on. So I think Mr. Poilievre could make the case that he's the government in waiting, which of course is what the official opposition is. That he shares some of the same concerns as the Trump administration, that he's going to get Canada's fiscal house in order, create a better climate for investment, cut corporate taxes, all the kinds of things that Mr. Trump's administration will likely do. So I think there's some common ground there. The problem, of course, is that will that look too American to Canadian voters, and will Mr. Trudeau then be able to say Mr. Poilievre is a mini MAGA, mini Trump? But the danger in that, of course, is, I mean, there's a danger in that. One, as you say, it's an assertive Canada, an assertive Prime Minister, an assertive Trudeau might look good with voters. Again, that kind of anti-American strain in Canadian identity. But Mr. Trump is not a person who likes people making fun of him or picking on him, and how do you then have a good relationship? I'm speaking as if I was Mr. Trudeau, right? How would Mr. Trudeau have a good relationship with big MAGA if he's going around saying Mr. Poilievre is mini MAGA? So there's a dangerous razor's edge, to use a terrible kind of metaphor, but that Mr. Trudeau will have to walk politically, because he can't bash the Conservatives, as they've already begun doing, the Liberals, as a mini MAGA movement. If you also want to have good relations with a very temperamental person who is very much at the center of power.
Well, there's certainly no question. Donald Trump's going to be the gift that keeps on giving for the foreseeable future, both in the Rumble Room and I think media around the globe, whether it's media like ours or conventional media, whatever. Donald Trump is always going to be a headliner. We're going to talk more on our next Rumble Room about BC politics and what's going on in the national scene. And believe it or not, there are other issues that have nothing to do with politics. We'll talk about that as well. But for now, John, perhaps you could again tell people how they can regularly follow the Rumble Room and become part of our Rumble Room viewing family.
Absolutely, I will. And you're right. I feel some election and political fatigue, although there is consistent great content coming out of that realm. Look, so much to learn, so much to listen to. Love hearing from people. You folks who haven't yet found us, we're available on Twitter. We can be found on Facebook. Of course, all of our interviews are on YouTube. We're also on audio podcasts, so you can listen to us. If that's the only way you can get a hold of us, we're on Instagram. We're also on TikTok. Love the feedback, folks. You can write whatever you want. We read it. We don't always agree with it, and we don't always respond to it, but we love it. Watch the show for now, and I have to say, I truly mean this from the bottom of every bit of my soul. I'm a very proud Canadian. I'm John Jurisic, and irrespective of the Donald, feel optimistic that we can still make the right decisions moving forward as we build a better society and a better North America that fits into a world context.
Well, that's very positive, John. I'm Robin Adair, and this heartens me so much. I think about an analogy of Donald Trump. If you elect a clown to office, you end up with a circus, and rumble on.